I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank the Franklin Historical Society in particular for helping me set this up and being willing to do this for the community. My name is Jason Barney. I've been teaching at NVU for 20 years. I've been lucky enough to write a couple of books. So you're seeing me in my informal summer outfit. School starts in 2 days, so I'll be shirting and tying it here in a little bit. So with the books that I've written, one of the books in particular, there was a chapter where I wanted to tell the story of the Back to the Land movement in Franklin County. And through a little bit of research, I think the first person that I reached out to was Bruce Todd. And then through some of the other individuals who I was lucky enough to contact, several of them did start to respond, and they came to understand that a local history teacher was sort of geeking out on history. So another thing that I want to point out today, and this is kind of critical to what I would hope is going to be a successful event, if there are any of you who have family stories of people who interacted with the commune, or you saw the people from the commune visiting the Franklin General Store, or you saw the horses out on the roads, those sorts of stories I would also like to have captured as part of today's presentation, because what happened on the property is certainly fascinating, and you'll see a little bit of that today. But if locals could also tell another part of that story, I think that would be wonderful. So, I'll start off also by talking a little bit about the format. So I'm actually not going to present that much. I would imagine that I'll go for about 20 minutes or a half hour. I have a brief slideshow that is designed to tell the story of the commune, highlight some of these guys, and kind of give folks an update where my research is. I do not have a book contract for the story of the Franklin Commune yet, although I do think it is worth a book, and I certainly have put a lot of research time into that hopeful eventual outcome. So let me just check my notes to make sure that I'm not, oh, the other thing I wanted to mention, I think I saw Hugh Gates. Is Hugh here? Was Franklin Town meeting, was that held in here in the 1970s? So I wanted to point out that in 1970, when the Franklin Commune started up, there were members of the commune who attended town meeting in 1970, and it would have been held in this hall. So just a neat little historical nugget. So this is the old house. The present day road, I believe, if you go on Google Maps, is Shady Maple Lane, and the Corey family owns the property now. This house no longer exists. This house burned down in the late fall of 1971, something that these folks may talk about here in a minute. But this house has been a particular source of research for me, because when the folks moved into Franklin, they altered this house quite a bit, and they spent 2 winters or a little bit more in it. So I've always been fascinated finding out where they were doing their canning, where the kids were raised, that sort of thing. I'll talk a little bit more about the house in a minute. So I also want to spend a little bit of time today, and it's kind of representative of how many people have shown up for this presentation. My understanding, and one of my reads from the Franklin Commune, is that many of the out-of-staters who came to Vermont who tried to engage in the Back to the Land thing, they could not have done what they did without the help of some locals. And this is a photo of Nene Mormon. Bart Melfi and I visited Nene and the Mormon family just a couple of minutes ago before the presentation started. The Mormon family was very nice to the folks who had moved on to the commune, and that was one of the relationships that solidified over the long term. Another individual who was key to the commune was George Truax. That may be a name that some of you are familiar with. I believe George Truax's farm or horses were right here at the end of the village, And I wanted to include this because as a researcher, I mentioned that I had reached out to several of the people who had lived on the commune. And in fact, the guy who took most of these photos, Larry Mead, I started to ask him about whether or not he remembered certain things in the commune. And it was a phone interview, and he started crying. And he just remembered that day so vividly, partly because George Truax had given so much time to the folks who were on the commune with the horses, and a lending hand to a lot of the back to land stuff that they were involved in. Walt Bennett, this is a still taken from an old film, Vermont Speaks for Itself. I believe this is one of the folks who started the commune, or was on the commune for a long period of time, Peter McFarland. Walt Bennett was also somebody who helped out the sugaring season and was very helpful to what they were trying to do. I do not have a picture of Grace Spooner. I do not have a picture of Ken Spooner. However, in my research, the Spooner family was also another family where the relationships were very strong. Often the folks who lived on the commune would walk up through the woods and visit the Spooner property at the top of the hill. And I think quite a few good, solid memories were made visiting the commune, or visiting the Spooners and helping them out. And there was a little bit of a side connection here. My mom used to do some home health work. She would help elderly folks as they got a little bit older. And I grew up in Highgate. Grace Spooner lived in my house when she was in her 90s. And I wish I had had the interest in local history back then that I do now, because Grace may have been peppered with a question or two about the 1970s. So what were they trying to do? So they will have an opportunity to come up and chat with you guys here in a minute. But one of the things that they were trying to do is they were trying to go back. They were trying to live off the land in a way that all of our ancestors did a long, long time ago. So they used horses, and they used horses for a lot of their manual work. These photos, I believe, were taken by Ross Payne, or somebody who was in that crew in a visit in 1971. And they would use the horses out in the sugar bush, and they would collect the sap, and the horses would bring the sap back to the main tanks at the sugar house. And almost all of the communards, almost all of the people who lived on the commune remember this very fondly. There were a couple of them who worked with the horses a little bit more than the others. Peter McFarland and another person who lives out in California now, Mary Pat. But the horses were key to a lot of the manual labor that was going on. And as a researcher, I was tickled when this came up. This is a April 23rd, 1970 article from the St. Albans Messenger, where the Ed Price, the reporter for the Messenger, stopped by the commune. And I'll just leave this up here for a moment so people can read it.
Jason?
Yeah.
I'm having a hard time seeing it. Would you be willing to read it?
Oh, sure. So I won't read the whole thing, but I'll just, and I can make this available for anybody who would like to see it. Basically, the reporter for the Messenger, he was interested in the commune movement because, I should have mentioned this at the start of the presentation, there were about 200 communes that popped up in the state of Vermont, late 69 into 1970, 71. And the Franklin commune was one of them. So the reporter for the Messenger, I get the feeling he just went to his editor and said, hey, I think I want to take a ride up and see what's going on. So he drove up, and I believe the young woman who's got the kid when he comes out of the house, I believe that would be Mary Pat. And I believe the tall individual who's being questioned here is Bruce. So, and the story was quite lengthy. It was 2 pages for me to fit it on the PowerPoint, but it's just an indication that the press at the time was even interested. And Franklin County in 1970 was a pretty conservative location. For them to devote ink to the commune was an interesting piece of research to find. So one of the things that I talk about with my students at NVU are the local connections to history. So Kent State happens in 1970. And Kent State is the situation in Ohio where the Nixon administration had, I believe in February and March, okayed the invasion of Cambodia. A lot of people in the United States were not comfortable with the war in Vietnam. When it spread into Cambodia, there were protests all over the place. Kent State, there were 4 students who were killed by National Guardsmen. So in researching some of the Burlington Free Presses, Charlie Pratt is one of the individuals who was on the commune. He's one of the eight people who were there starting it. Charlie Pratt, after the Kent State protests, or during the Kent State protests down in Burlington, he got arrested with a group of other people for trying to stop a bus because there were people who had signed up for the military who were going to go register with the military, and he sat in front of the bus and tried to stop the bus. Just a neat piece of information about what the people who had moved to Franklin were involved with. So their families came to visit occasionally. Again, this is Peter McFarland and the horses. I believe one of the young ladies is his niece. Can you guys, who's the other?
Adrian, my daughter.
Adrian. So there are a couple of stories where even the family members of the people who are living on the commune, they come to visit. And sometimes those interactions were full of love and, hey, how are you doing? And it's nice to check up on you. And then other times it was like, what has happened to you? What's wrong with you? Family did come to visit, and that's also something that is important to catch as I researched the town. So in 1970, I think this photo was taken in 1971, but it kind of makes a point. 1970 was a very dry year, and the water on the property went bad. They had to come to the general store to buy water. They were bringing in water from the property, and they had animals on the land, and they had the kids on the land. So it wasn't like they couldn't do anything. So because of this dry summer, one of the original 8 ends up leaving during that time period, just because life is getting really, really hard, doing all this manual labor and bringing in all of the water. And Lou, I believe this is you, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So the second sugaring season is 1971. I believe they're not selling a lot of their syrup locally. I believe they have connections down in New York, and some of the syrup is going down to New York City. A story that I've heard a number of times and have adopted. I'm a pretty big coffee drinker, and my family has been doing maple syrup since I was a little kid. And on the commune, they would put maple syrup in their coffee quite often. I've tried it; it's pretty good. If you don't want sugar, if you want a little maple taste to it, it's pretty good. So, in the research about what they were trying to do in Franklin, they did have a lot of animals, as you've seen in some of the earlier photos. They had the horses, they had a number of cows, and they had pigs, chickens. I think later on I found a reference where there were some rabbits on the property. So these are some examples of things that Franklin County farmers may have been trying all of their life. Families have abandoned that sort of thing to a certain degree, but folks on the commune tried to raise these animals, and in some instances, they process these animals on their own as well. So I mentioned the George Truax barn fire. So these photos are not photos that are out and around because I've gotten into the research so much. I emailed the messenger to see if, when I went to newspapers.com If you have a newspapers.com account, it's a wonderful thing. You can spend hours losing yourself. I did a search of George Truax just because I knew he was such a friend of the Commune. And George is mentioned in the newspaper. I believe this fire is like July 27th, 1971. And the story is that on the day of the fire, several of the people on the Commune actually went down to George's property to talk with him and to console him and to be with him. From a research perspective, when I realized that the messenger only prints one photo, and their reporter may have taken 9 or 10, I asked if I could have copies of those photos, and that's what you're seeing now. I don't believe this photo was printed, and even if it was printed, you wouldn't get the clarity of an actual negative. So, there was a fascination in the 1970s of geocentric domes. In one commune in Vermont, in Glover, there was a very large geocentric dome that was constructed. In Franklin, there was nothing that was that large, but this is that fellow Larry Mead's home during the summer of 1971. He created this with a little bit of, I believe it's Mylar plastic, and in the phone interview that I had with him, he was quite proud that that was his living situation for the entire summer. Another individual who, I mentioned that there were kids on the Commune, who has been very kind with his time. This is Peter Hutcher, who lives out in California. That's his wife at the time, Linda, and their child is Noah. Noah's born in the fall. This is one of my favorites because it does show the house, but the story for Peter Hutcher was that when Linda went into labor, she went to the St. Albans Hospital. And Peter, being the person who'd been out in the garden all day and working, he was pretty filthy. He was not in presentable, he was not very presentable. So he showed up at the hospital. His wife's going into labor. And the doctor said, "You gotta go home and shower first." And I could hear the resentment in his voice 50 years later. So he went home and he showered, and I believe he missed the birth of his son because the doctor said, "Sorry, you gotta clean up." So something else which the messenger has been great about, this is late 1971. I believe this is one of the individuals who moves on to the Commune a little bit later on, Libby Albright. The story mentions 2 women from the Franklin Commune go to Enesburg High School and they address a social studies class. And they cause a little bit of a stir. Community members find out that these people living on the Franklin Commune are in the kids advertising the communal way of living. And let's just say there were some complaints to the school board, et cetera, et cetera. As a researcher, one of the reasons why I put this here is because I found the name of the teacher, and I think she's probably still alive. She was pretty young in 1971, and I would love to interview her to see if she remembers this interaction. So then you get to November of 1971. The Messenger covered this. The County Courier didn't exist yet. It was the Swanton Courier at the time. The Swanton Courier covered it. The Burlington Free Press covered it. The Franklin house was destroyed by a fire, and nobody was hurt. Earlier in the commune movement, there had been a fire down in another commune in the southern part of the state, where I believe 4 people had died. Nobody was hurt here in Franklin. But once I read this, and once I saw this story, I was just like, whoa, wait a minute, there's one photo there. Does the Messenger have other photos? So just this last summer, I emailed the Messenger, and these are some of the photos that did not make print in late November of 1971. And this is what the house looked like as it was still smoldering. And this is also another research vein for me. So the Treux family who does the busing, I believe he would be the grandfather of my student, Marcel. He was on the Franklin Volunteer Fire Department on the morning of this, and he had to get out of high school. He he had to get out of class to go to the fire. So I want to follow up with him, and because that's another neat little research vein. And then this would be the house, what the house looked like as you drive up the driveway on the morning after the fire. So the fire happens. The people who are in Franklin, I'm sure there are discussions about giving up and finishing up. They discussed a lot of things. They had a lot of meetings, but they decided to try to rebuild. And they decided to try to rebuild in the middle of the winter. So this building, which is the one that follows the greenhouse, is one that they were building in December of 1971 into January and February of 1972. And there was a communal network at the time. So when this fire happened, the Mormon families were very nice. The Mormon family was very nice and offered some space. The other communes offered to help out so that work shifts could crash at different locations. I know a lot of us Vermonters, a lot of we Vermonters think that we're rugged and tough and we can do anything in the wintertime. Trying to build a home in the middle of the January freeze is a pretty rugged undertaking for a group of out-of-staters. And the progress of the building is quite impressive. Some of the original folks do get tired of the project. They do move on, but others try to stick it out, and others try to see the completion of this building. And that is what that building looked like very close to when it was finished. This photo is from somebody who I've just barely made contact with. His name is Steve Levinson, and he has been a gold mine of research, where these folks are the originals, and you'll have your chance to chat and hear from them in a moment. Steve was one of the individuals who stayed on the commune a lot later. And, teacher mode, if I were showing this in the class, what does this show you about what the people in Franklin were trying to do even after the fire? What work are they still trying to do even after the fire? Yeah, they're still trying to sugar, which sugaring alone is a lot of work. Trying to sugar and finish this house is pretty amazing. So I also want to mention somebody who's not here today, Hal Bill. Hal Bill is not a local, but he becomes a local. His family's from Hardwick. Hal spent time on the commune, and Hal and I have gone over a lot of the photos. We think that this is probably the only photo of him on the commune at the time. Hal was pretty involved in some of the gardening projects, and he wishes that he could be here today, but he can't. So I'll finish up with some research. I mentioned that my research is still going on. My mind works chronologically, so when I hear a story from these guys, or if I hear stories from you, I'm immediately going to try to think about, okay, is that this year, or does that happen this month? So Steve, I can imagine me doing this. Steve actually kept a notebook from 1972 or 1973, and the list of stuff that you see here, I believe the Franklin's General Store was owned by the Riley family at one time. So in the middle column here, you can see where he's keeping tabs on all of the stuff that they spent, all the money that they spent at Franklin General Store. So this is in a notebook that Steve Levinson has had in a closet for about 50 years. This is from another individual who was on the commune. The commune became a home for some out-of-state runaways. And the out-of-state runaways are kind of key to the story of Franklin. Jess Treux has had this in a binder for 50 years, and he just barely shared it with me and the folks who were on the commune just a couple of days ago. As a researcher and the Back to the Land movement, I consider this gold, because he's literally mapping out the plots of land when they're planting and what they were trying to grow. So as far as the Back to the Land movement goes, this is a really, really good, interesting piece. So Jess also shared some of the photos from the last year of the commune. They still had the horses. They were still working. I'll just mention this, and I don't want to go too deeply into this, because on the commune, some members of the commune maybe didn't get along particularly well. Some members of the community maybe didn't get along with the commune members. This is sort of the end of the commune. There is a local family who kind of moved in, and you guys can speak to this anymore if you want, but the communal effort was sort of coming to an end, and that local family kind of hastened the end of the commune in 1973. But this is a picture of the end of the work in 1973. So commune members have gone back and visited the property. Peter Hutcher, who I mentioned before, he visited in 1980 and took this photo of the old barn. And this is also kind of gold, because this would be 8 years after the commune, but you can see where the original house sat. And at one point in time, they did try to rebuild the house or a version of a sawmill on that original property. And that's Peter enjoying the abandoned land in 1980. And this is that house that the people on the commune built in the fall of 1971, or winter of 1971 into 1972. And I wanted to end with this image, I believe. This house no longer exists. This house, I talked with the Corey family who owns the property now, and I think this house went down maybe 5 or 6 years ago. All right. That's all I have to share. I guess what I would, before I invite you guys to come up, is there anybody in the room, sorry, I'm gonna put my teacher voice on. Is there anybody in the room brave enough, or is there anybody who would like, if you were a local who has a family story of seeing the communards out and about? Anybody want to share anything along those lines?
The Mormons are here.
I will.
Sure. Would you mind stating again?
I'm Patty, and we were their neighbors. And the story that I remember is one day going by, we were on Beaver Meadow Road, and you were all going to Harvest Week. And all the cows and the people that went by our house to Harvest Week. That's one of the memories that I have.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Our next door neighbors.
They were your next door neighbors? And what's your name?
I'm Mary Gates. My mother was town and treasurer in Franklin. And I was born and brought up in Franklin. Over in South Franklin. And finally we bought a farm, my folks bought a farm on Beaver Meadow Road. Just down the road from the commune. They came there to live. And they'd come walking up the road and stop in and see us and wanted to know, did my father need any help? They got a lot of help over here. Wanted to help us. No, we were doing all right. But, you know, we're on this road, the Beaver Meadow is there, and it was flooded. And nobody could drive across that road because the bridge was so bad. And so here's all these people walking up and down the road all day long. Nobody we knew, you know. We knew they came from the commune. But nobody ever bothered us, really.
Thank you. Anybody else? I'm hoping more people may be willing to speak up in a moment or two. I want to invite Bridget to come on up, Barb Melfi, Lou Andrews, Bruce Dunn. Bridget, what, I
Okay.
don't know if this turned up. Why don't we start with you? You
Sure.
just mentioned your sort of association with Franklin,
Yes.
and then we'll go down the line, Barb, to Jennifer's.
So for clarity, I never lived at Franklin. I visited a lot. Primary reason was that there were so many communes in Vermont, 10 of which, I would say 10, correct me if I'm wrong, were closely affiliated. We shared a lot of resources, time, everything we had. And when the house burned, when the Franklin house burned, the children from Franklin came to the commune where I was, which was the Mount Philo Collective Commune in Charlotte. We were at the Mount Philo Inn, and had purchased that inn, and so there's tons of room. And the kids came to Philo, and as part of the trade, more or less, Philo folks went to Franklin to help with the building projects, to help with sugaring, to help with everything that they were doing. And I probably spent a total of a month at Franklin, and once as I was leaving Philo, I went to Franklin. I remember sitting in a great big tent. That's pretty much what I remember. But it was a very different situation than I was living in. We were more of a suburban, urban collective, and we were working mostly in Burlington. So the Back to the Landers were well, I think most of the communes were in Vermont were back to the land communes. And so we shared. We went back and forth to a lot of these places and worked with them and helped them when we could. And I think the Franklin kids never went back to Franklin all as a group, did they? No. So they went from Philo to another kids collective and kept on moving around with all the kids. At one point, I think we had, how many kids did we have at Philo? Maybe 20? Yeah, maybe 20 children lived with us. Yeah.
When you say these are children, you're talking about young children?
Yes, there we go. Anywhere from, I don't know, there were babies. We had 4 in diapers at Philo, so that kind of gives you a sense of, and then all the way up to Beth and Ben, who were in their
They were 8, 9 years old.
9, 10, somewhere in there. So all ranging in age from really young. We had a little school, you know, it actually was fairly organized at Philo in terms of the children. Yeah, it's good. And I'm happy to answer questions once we've gone down the road here. Barbie?
Well, I would like to mention that with you and other people, we started a free clinic, and it was a very important time where we felt everybody should have health care, and so we started a clinic, and we met a few times and thought about how we're going to do it, and so Bridget was part of that, and I remember that, and I had to get down to Burlington once a week to do that, and that was very difficult because sometimes I was like thumbing out, and I can't even remember where I was thumbing out from. Because the commune is kind of way back, you know, so it was pretty funny. But I did do that, and so I lived in the commune. My husband at the time, Jim Nolfi, and I, and Mary Pat and Bruce started talking about doing a commune, and we had a friend that Jim and I had made, and she wanted to put money into a land because she had lost some land. So, and she was interested in our plans to be a commune. She wanted to support young people who had different ideas. So she bought land for us, and we moved on to that. And we moved on to that in winter, as I remember.
Yes, we did.
It was cold.
February 1st.
February 1st. So anyway, and then we were there for 2.5 years and moved on to do other things.
I am Lou Andrews, and I was one of the original people on the farm. And can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
All right. my husband and I came to Vermont from Madison, Wisconsin, because he got a teaching job at UVM, which is what Jim had gotten a job here too, and that's sort of how we connected with the original 4 that came from California. So we became the original 6, and then a couple more people joined before we actually moved onto the farm. For me, I think of all the people who moved onto the farm initially, I was sort of the accidental hippie. I was a young mother and had 2 children at the time, Beth, who was 8, and Aiden, who was just turning 3. But I had been a housewife and putting my husband through college and graduate school and basically babysitting for a living. So this was a whole new world for me in education, a wonderful opportunity for me to feel valued as an individual, not as somebody's wife. The women's movement was a very important part of my experience at the farm, as well as everything else. I mean, living on the land was also really important to me. So I guess for me, it was just an amazing change of life. I mean, I felt for the first time like a valued individual, developed my own opinions about things, and felt a lot of support and love from the other people there.
My name is Bruce Tao. I was known as Crow at the Commune. I saw the Commune as part of a larger cultural revolution that was happening at the time. So I was motivated to be in the Commune. Though this may sound like a tough link to make, but I was in the Commune in the hopes of ending the war. And there were a variety of options available to people who wanted to end the war or address the environmental concerns that were terrifying us, especially us who had young children who were going to give them the world we've given them. And we had the notion that we could live, it's so naive, I laugh. Because, you know, the 30-year-old kid and what he says, and an 82-year-old man and what he says. But we believed we were going to live the post-revolutionary lifestyle in pre-revolutionary times. And we explored with courage the smashing, the emotional smashing of things that had values to us. So we were immensely experimental. The thing I take the most pride in is that we walked the talk. We didn't say, oh, it would be nice maybe to have a farm and some cows. We got a farm and some cows. And we believed that we could model a collective lifestyle that would be more efficient, less, that there were more hands to do the work. Just classic that the humans were supposed to live in collective forms more than in individual nuclear families. That the individual nuclear family was the enemy. I know that sounds a little weird, but we walked around saying smash monogamy like it was a glass jug that you could hit with a hammer, and now we had smashed it. And believe me, we did smash it, but it didn't exactly. You know, once you're smashed, then what do you do? So we wanted the kids to be collectivized. We wanted the kids smash patriarchy. After all, what's the root of all evil? The root of all evil is the patriarchy. the dominant male who controls the family and causes the women to feel in their subservient positions, and the children don't think they're independent. So we tried to collectivize everything: income, debt, clothing. There was some very funny jokes. You were supposed to pick your clothes out of the clothes pile, but if you didn't get one you fit in, you were allowed to like pick for one you liked. And sooner or later, everybody had the clothes they liked back, just like everybody had the woman they liked back. You know? For me, besides being back on the land, which was so romantic, so beautiful, so, I mean, you know, but we didn't, what it's like to be part of nature, to feel like you're part of nature as opposed to part from nature. Just, it touched all of us, and we, amongst the communes in Vermont, were particularly interested in the political aspect as well as the agrarian aspect. So we actively sought other communes. The quintessential story of this commune, I think, is what was called the Gathering of the Tribes in the fall of 70.
1970.
And Lou and I, this is 70, there's no cell phones, we ripped out the electric, there's no computers. Lou and I drove around in a van all over Vermont, going to as many communes as we could, saying, hey, the Franklin commune is having a gathering of the tribes on such and so a weekend, please join us. And hundreds, I don't know how many hundreds, but hundreds of people joined us. And things like the Kids Collective and the free health care and a food co-op and a number of other things emerged from that. And so for me, it continues to be more my experiences in the cultural revolution of that period of time. I mean, I went to a demonstration, I knew people I don't want to talk to you about, but most of all, I thought of myself as a revolutionary more than as a communard. And I think that the other people also believed that. We were doing this because we wanted to change the society that we believed was dysfunctional and cruel. I just had an opportunity to watch a 15-minute video of Lou's husband, who is now deceased, in which he talked about being on the commune. And what he said was that he felt the love. And I thought that was just, it was fabulous that that's what stood out for this man, was that there were all these people who loved him. He could act like an Indian at times, and everybody would bring him back into the fold. So I think I should stop.
So part of this is to hear from these folks, but as a historian, I definitely want to hear any stories that we, people from Franklin County, might have. So is there anybody else who's willing to speak of a family story of seeing them at the Franklin General Store or encountering them at one point in time?
Did the white dog with the 3 legs sneak the milk from the Gates farm regularly? Is that where that dog got fed?
I remember seeing the dog, but I don't think it did.
I think it knew where your milkshake was.
I had just an anecdote following the slide of fire.
Yes.
And in the fire department, and who came to put out the fire. Sometime previous, I don't remember exactly when, I believe the fire department was raising money. And Charlie and I, my husband and I, who inherited some of his mother's mahogany furniture, which thought was so ugly, and it was stored in the barn. And we donated that to the Franklin Fire Department as part of the fundraiser. Maybe it's in some of your homes.
Any stories? So one of the things that I'm up against, and as a teacher, I should let you guys know, teaching the local history class at NDU, I actually have not developed a union on the communes yet, just because I'm very nervous in the politically charged atmosphere that I teach in, that I would be in some way I'd be accused of forwarding my beliefs one way or the other on kids. So even though I teach the local history, I mentioned that the Franklin Commune was there, and I will chat with students, but I haven't developed a union on it, and it's not something that I cover in any great amount of detail. Yeah, sorry.
May I just suggest to you as a teacher, and you're probably doing this, but look at the whole picture of everything that was going on, because these people came into our community, we didn't know them, we thought we were really silly.
Yes, sir.
But there were other things that were going on at the time. We felt very threatened by, we never had this before, but drugs coming into young people. I mean, there were all kinds of social things that were happening. So please put that into your perspective.
Long before I made contact with any of these folks, I was having Vietnam War guest speakers come in and talk about their experiences during the war.
Another one of the women that lived with me at Philo, Celia and I taught a class at U32 on utopian communities way back then. So that kind of, you look at the history of the earlier unsuccessful utopian communities, bringing it up to then, the present day of the 70s, and what was going on. And it was a little bit more, I don't know, maybe constructive. U32 was a pretty radical place at the time, so it didn't raise any hackles at all. But it's another way to, to define what you're teaching. It doesn't have to be a long unit. I still think I have some stuff from that, so if you want it, I could definitely give it to you. Yeah.
Jay, I was thinking, coming over here, that we often don't mention Bernie Sanders as part of our experience, though he was. And in some ways, and don't get me started on the Democratic Party, but in some ways, Bernie Sanders could have been the president of the United States, and free Vermont would have won the revolution.
So,
No, Bernie never lived on a commune, though he visited communes.
And his child, his oldest son, was a member of the kids thing that
Right.
was at I used to see him all the time.
I believe the question was, did Bernie ever come
Come where?
to the commune?
Not to Frank.
He
Yeah.
did come to Philo. He did not. I don't know if he came.
No, but he came to Glover one day,
That's right.
and we were working hard, we were dragging logs for a house out of the woods, and Bernie wanted to talk. And it was like, didn't you come here to work?
Patty, I think Patty Rainville's Grace Spooner's granddaughter, right? And we chatted a while ago, and she has a memory. Would you like to share about your grandpa and Bernie?
Well, I have several memories. And I really would love to talk to you guys afterwards. I don't know the year. I just remember that I was a young girl, and my grandparents would only do one hang a year in the season. It took all summer for my grandfather and grandmother to hang. And I remember being there one time, and I'm going to call you the hippies because that's what my grandmother did. They came from way down over the backfield, and we were hanging. And the women had the long dresses, skirts on, with the bangles around their ankles and on their wrists. And they were barefoot. And they were walking through the hayfield, and they just all came up and started helping my grandfather hang. And my grandmother kept telling me to close my mouth, because I was just like, they're barefoot, walking in a hayfield. And then, one of the other times I remember, the horse barn was going down. And I don't know how you guys knew, but you came up from back over the hill with your horses with great big logs. And you went over onto the porch and you picked up my grandfather, who at the time had no legs, he had both his legs amputated. And you carried him down in the wheelchair and you put him by the horse barn. And he directed you guys, even though I don't think you needed any direction. But you had the big work horses and those big logs, and you pushed the horse barn back up onto the foundation. And my grandmother brought out this aluminum pitcher with Kool-Aid in it, which I think was 3/4 sugar with just a little bit of Kool-Aid. Because I don't know how many packs of Kool-Aid she had, but she was always making a pitcher of Kool-Aid. And those were some of the great memories I had about you guys coming. And my grandfather, I never witnessed it, but my grandfather, I believe, was pretty big into politics. And I think Mr. Gates can help me out with that. And I remember him telling me that Bernie Sanders sat on the porch and played cribbage with him one time.
And one of the days we went up there, it was about to rain, and there were bales in the hay.
Yeah.
In the field. There had to be a dozen of us who went up there, kids, women, men. It was something to do. And we started moving down the field. You know, you need 4 or 5 people to effectively load a hay wagon, one throwing from each side, and a couple of people loading, somebody driving. Lou's husband was so excited, he was throwing the bales over the wagon, so that the guy on the other side was having to pick them up. You know, it was that kind of a spirit, if you will. And Grace was like, oh, your children are so nice. And we're like, these are barbarians. They're locusts. They've come in, they've eaten our cookies and lemonade like we didn't have water.
So today, Richard and I were haying, and we borrowed somebody else's baler. It needs a lot of work, and the kicker bale part, the kicker belt broke. So he wanted to hurry up and get it baled. The guy's gonna come up and pick up the hay. So he baled it onto the ground, and Jay had suggested that maybe you guys would have a chance to come up and see us before you started. And he goes, if they come, tell them we've got bales on the ground.
This happened frequently because everybody had to know everything, theoretically. Peter McFarland, who was by far our most gifted carpenter, horseman, etc., he was supposed to do a day with the kids in the kitchen, which he didn't like and didn't think was a good use of his resources. Everybody who wanted to had to be able to drive the team, etc. So when we were backing this very heavy hay wagon into the hay mow at the Schooners, whoever was driving the tractor at this time couldn't get the wagon straight from going up the ramp. What are we waiting around for? Just unhitch that thing and we'll push it in. And there were enough of us that we did that, you know, just take it off, push it in, unload it, bring it back. So there was some advantages to having many people.
I just wanted to say something about Grace and Ken Spooner. They were so close to our hearts. They were just remarkable people. And I think the first time that we interacted was, I don't know how she got our phone number, but Grace called us up on the phone and said, have you seen my cow? He got loose. And so we went looking for the cow, and I just remember thinking, how bold of her, how wonderful that she would just pick up the phone, talk to these weirdo people, and so it was just, we were neighbors.
Before we end, I just want to say we made a lot of mistakes, and we know it. So don't think that we may have been more arrogant then, but we're less arrogant now.
Well, may I say, I thought you were silly, but we made plenty of mistakes too.
Thank you.
So one of the themes has been the relationships and the memories that people share. So George Truax, do any of you want to say a word about George Truax and what he meant to the commune?
So, George Truax was a very good friend of ours. And he helped us with sugaring, he helped us with horse use and how that happened. And we could go anywhere in the countryside and find horse equipment because people weren't using it anymore. So we were able to find that and use that for our horse work. And and we had, at P.E.G, I think we had 3 teams. And they did everything. They helped us sugar, they helped us with haying, they helped us with, they didn't plow because we did that with a tractor, but we did everything else with horses. So that was George Truax that really helped us with that. And he also knew places in Canada where you could get horse equipment as well. So we would go up there and work with him for that. He was just a friend of all of us, you know. And he always thought that the women at Franklin were so beautiful. And what were they doing being sort of single? What was going on?
Didn't Peter and Shannon name their oldest son?
Yes.
Truax, right?
Truax, yes.
After our friend.
Yes.
Do you remember the names of your horses?
Mike and Jim,
Dolly,
Dolly.
Dolly.
Jack, the one that the
Jack.
Romans inflicted on us.
And what was the really ugly brown team? The one that kicked Dolly.
Oh, somebody kicked Dolly, yeah. And then we had ponies too, we had a couple of ponies.
Yeah, we had ponies, yeah. Yeah, and they were fun to ride.
Yeah, the kids loved that.
The kids liked that.
I would ask if you all have questions of us, curious about anything, we can try to answer. There are some things we don't remember.
When you say the kids, like you send all the kids to Philo,
Right.
work with them, I mean, where were the parents?
Well, the Franklin parents mostly stayed at Franklin, but revolved through Philo. So for instance, Lou might come down for a couple of weeks and somebody from Philo would go to Franklin. And so the kids, the Franklin kids were obviously more familiar with their parents, although they had a ball with all the other kids. So the Franklin parents would come down to Philo, stay for a while, go back to Franklin. Philo people would go up to Franklin, those who wanted to, and then, you know, it moved like that. It's kind of a circle, yeah.
What caused that sort of dissolution of the movement?
A number of factors, I mean, I'll say a couple and if other people have something. What caused the dissolution of the commune? Well, partly trying to hammer that green wood in the middle of the winter. One thing that kind of set some of us over the edge. Also, when we were there, keep in mind this was winter, we were all staying in this tiny little one-room building that the women had built as a women's refuge. So it was a one room with a loft. So all of us who were working on trying to build it, we were also trying to live in this tiny little space. So it was difficult, and I think that, you know, being a farmer, it's, you know, we were there for 2.5 years. I think at least the originators were there about that time. But we quickly learned with the commune that, you know, in the summertime, so many people would come. Hey, you know, they were there. It was great because they helped us harvest and, you know, put up food. And Barbara was great canner of food. And, but then come winter, back to the original 8. So winters were really challenging, and we were not farmers. We did, well, speaking of myself, I don't know if anybody else had any farming.
I have a different point of view,
Go for it.
which is, we were always trying to figure out how to make money. So one of the things that Peter McFarland decided to do was he was going to do a sawmill. Now, I feel like a sawmill is a great idea, but it's not good for children. So that was what finally drove me out, because I felt like I didn't want our children to be around a saw and, sawdust and all the other stuff that comes with a sawmill. So I don't know if he ever really did that, but the whole plan of it for me was like sort of the end. I just couldn't see being part of that. And so I moved to a nearby place called, the town of Enesburg. And some of my friends went with me. Libby went and Mary Pat. So there were other people that went with us, and ultimately somebody bought us a house, and we moved into that house in Enesburg, and there was still community there, but it was much smaller and it was more able to deal with it, and it was people that I was close with. So it worked out pretty well for a while, and then the house that I was living in burned down. So I had different house fires that and I don't, what is it about me is it attracts fire. But anyway, that was that issue too, and so I moved into Burlington at that point, so and my child started going to a public school, and he was at that age, so it was, I felt, a little easier to deal with, but I was still part of the clinic.
Yes. I left Philo because I found what I thought would be my life's work, which was at the People's Free Clinic, which is now the Community Health Center, which has outlets all over the state, and I wanted to devote as much of my time as I could. One thing about living on a commune or a collective, you spend a lot of time processing. And we were devoted to the processing. I mean, devoted to the point where it takes over your life. We had kids' meetings, kitchen meetings, men's meetings, women's meetings, house meetings. So every single night you were freaking processing, and it got to me. And I felt I've always been more of a feet on the ground, get it done kind of person, and I was getting a little frustrated with that, and I moved into a house in Burlington with another group of people, and we were not collectivized, but we were very, very close, and I stayed there for a long time as well. I think it was different for everyone. Why? And the Vietnam War ended. That was that was a point. We coalesced around that anti-war movement. So when that was over, we figured out a little bit about I think most of us figured out what we wanted to do, and went off and did those things. So.
2 questions?
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I'm curious about a couple things related to the location here in Franklin. First is what sort of a resource Lake Carmi was to the commune, the relationship of the commune to the lake. And then if there was a similar movement going on north of the border, if there were communes in southern Quebec that you interacted with at all, or?
Good questions. No communes that I know of in Canada that we were in touch with.
No.
We had interesting contacts in Canada, and
Right.
none with Carmi as far as I'm concerned. We would get grain in Canada because it was less expensive. We would get sawdust for bedding in Canada from mills there. we would drive big sided 3/4 ton trucks there, that the border patrol got tired of poking pitchforks through the sawdust to see if we had any Chinese hidden in there. We went across the border frequently, sometimes legally, sometimes not. One of the favorite commune stories is that our favorite mayor was Dolly, and Peter and George figured out who was the premier stallion to breed Dolly, and that stallion happened to be in Canada. And the hassles with the border and the quarantine and all of that, so we just walked Dolly over the border, you know? So we like being outlaws in some way. We were anti-war, and part of the answer to what ended the commune, there's lots of internal things, tons of internal things. But
Such as, I mean, if that's a general term, what were the internal conflicts?
Philosophy.
different visions.
That's right.
Yeah.
Different visions, different perspectives on how it was working out for the kids. You know, it was ideally for the kids, and it was pretty clear that they were having a hard time, at least some of them. They didn't love all the ambiguities. Money was a hassle, huge hassle. It's worth mentioning that somebody else owned the land, and there was never a discussion about how we would purchase it from her. And so that was both very gracious, but also how unrealistic to be living on a plot of land that you're not paying a mortgage or the taxes on. So, there's a couple answers.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Don't answer these questions if they make you uncomfortable, but.
I can't hear you.
Oh, I said, don't answer these if they make, you very uncomfortable or something. Just, I'm wondering how much, or if at all, drugs affected your community. Also, free love and parentage, and rock and roll.
I have hearing aids here.
Some of those are
I'm having a hard time
stereotypes,
hearing people. If you'd stand up, that'd be really helpful for me.
She had trouble hearing you.
Sex and drugs and rock and roll.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, rock and roll?
So,
But those are stereotypes, I know, that get attached, and I wonder how real any of those stereotypes actually were.
I can only speak to what happened at Philo. I don't remember anything about Franklin and drugs, and they can speak to interpersonal stuff, but at Philo, there was a certain amount of marijuana smoking, and we had a little, we had a lot of conscientious objectors staying with us, and they worked at the hospital, and they would bring home things and make, all through our kitchen, we had beer processing going on. But I truly do not remember that it was a huge deal, at least where I was. We were busy and we were working on other things. We had it wasn't, for us anyway, it never felt lazy to me. It never felt lazy enough to have all those things. And rock and roll, I guess for some, maybe music was a background to all of this, but for us there, I certainly remember records and things like that, but I don't remember that it was a huge part. Sexual whatever you want to call it, there was quite a bit of that, and that was part of the smashing monogamy and trying to figure out, and it was very, very, very painful for a lot of people. And I think that if that worked, we'd all do it. It doesn't work, or maybe it does for some, but it didn't there so much because, at least for us, I think Franklin could speak for themselves, but for us it didn't work, and we realized that pretty quickly. And a lot of the things that happened, at least where I was, there were more people. We had 35, 40 people at Philo. So if you did become involved with somebody and that relationship ended, you had to continue living with that person. So that was a real difference in how most of us grew up, you know. And I was talking to my husband on the way here, and I said it was more, at least at Philo, it was more serial monogamy. You know what I mean? There were no memory for me of you know, orgies or anything like that. None at all. But Franklin had a different experience.
Well, I never enjoyed marijuana, so if there was marijuana around, some people smoked it, but I didn't necessarily. But I did like psychedelics a bit, and so I used some of those when I was at the farm, but not very often because we had a lot of work to do, and in the winter I would often go away and study. I became a physician's assistant, and so I would go and study with different people that would open their clinics or their hospitals for me. And I actually saw some births that were drugged at the hospital. So I was able to get a lot of information that in the winter I would sort of leave and do other things. So I wasn't there just freezing to death. I'd go to New York or Boston or someplace else and do some work. But it would be all about healthcare, really.
Yeah.
That was and then I ended up being a home birth midwife for a number of years, and so I really enjoyed that work, and that came out of the People's Free Clinic as well. So, yeah.
And the women's movement.
Yes.
And the women's movement for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, just to speak to the kids for a second. I had, my two girls were 5.5 years apart. When we moved onto the town, my younger was just turning 3 and my older was 8 years old. And she attended the Franklin Public School back in those years. Anybody here attend during those 70, 71? Did you?
What grade was she in?
She was in the 4th grade.
She was older than us.
Yeah, she was older than us.
'Cause I was
But
about
we were in school.
second
Oh,
grade.
okay.
Yeah.
I know, she never asked to move on to a commune.
No.
She had experienced a different life, a stable life, where we were in Madison, Wisconsin, where the husband was in school and I was home with the kids. So I didn't realize how difficult it was for her. I mean, we sent her off to school looking like a hippie, I don't know what kind of clothes, and I don't know how she got received there, but she's a very shy and sensitive kid, and I think she feels anyway at this point, even though she is in her 60s right now. It really had a lasting negative effect on her life. My younger loved the farm because of all the animals, and she was just so interested. Well, she was much more of an extrovert anyway, but it's just too different. And I was really, because of my own experience, feeling like, oh, the world is opening up to me. I was just, I just didn't pick up on how hard it was on the old.
So we've gone for about an hour and 20. I guess I want to start the process of finishing up. Are there any other local stories that people would want to share, whether or not you saw the communes or experienced them or visited? Anything that you guys want to finish up with?
I would like to just suggest if anybody wants to know more about the counterculture in Vermont particularly, I've developed a little resource list, a bunch of books, little films and things like that. If you want to share your contact information with me, I'd be happy to, I won't share it with anyone else, but I will send you my list and you can, there are a couple of short films. Lou and I did an interview for Vermont PBS, and there's a film actually of Philo where I was. There's a 20-minute film of that, and a bunch of books have been written about the Vermont experience, the Vermont counterculture experience. Happy to share that list with anybody who wants to know any more about that time and place.
That list is about to expand with.
Yeah. And just keep asking questions of your neighbors and getting the information to Jay so he can get this book out there.
I just want to say thank you to all of you who had some interest in our experience. It's kind of a little shocking, but very nice. Thank you.
And I feel the same. I think I was quite surprised that so many people came out and were really interested in what our experience was there. And it's very difficult to explain it all because it was very intense when you were there. And I'll mention one thing that was really pretty funny. So if people would have an animal that they had shot, for example, and they would bring it over to us and see if we wanted it, you know. So we had possums and rabbits and other kinds of things, and you know, I didn't know anything about how to cook those. But I always felt like it was them sharing with us, you know, and thinking about what we might want to eat.
I want Lou to tell the washing machine story because that's one of my favorites.
Well, one of the things, you know, going back to the land and back to the way things were. Well, we moved into this house that we had how many kids in diapers? Like 4 or 5 kids in diapers. One of the first things we did was take out the washing machine and the dryer. And we would, we're gonna do this by hand. How stupid were we? A number of things. We changed things. We gotta move the staircase in the house from over here to here, and then, maybe we should pull out the phone, and no, we need a phone, let's put it back. Kinds of things like that. And we were groping our way through to find the right ways to do things. Sometimes we didn't succeed.
So we ended up, of course, taking the diapers to the laundromat, washing them and drying them. So it didn't last that long with any of us. But for a while, we were doing that.
We were doing it by hand for a while. I didn't see too many people doing that. There was one other thing, I just wondered if anybody saw this, because this is one of my images of the things that we did. That one year, maybe it's probably the first year that we were there, we heard about the Enesburg Dairy Days. And we decided, well, we are going to go to the Enesburg Dairy Days, and we're going to do it in style. So we arc-welded out the whole front of a VW bus, and we hitched it to the horses. And we all got in, and we were carrying rifles with flowers in it. And I don't know if anybody ever saw that, but that's what that was about. Yes.
Was there any music? Did you sing together, or what did you do for music?
Well, we listened to a lot of music. I mean, we danced.
Oh, we did listen to music.
We did a lot of dancing. We did some naked dancing, I have to say.
Now we're getting to the details.
We And we go naked, of course.
Yes.
Yeah, you know, and then
You were the
all
only-
the local guys would come and ogle us.
This
But,
is,
you know,
this is all part of living intentionally.
So, as somebody who was born and raised in Franklin County, the story of the Back to the Landers is part of Franklin's story, the St. Albans story, Enesburg, so I just think that you guys coming back to Franklin 50 years after the fact is really special, and I want to thank you for coming, and thank all of you for coming to hear this.
That's great.